The moon landing changed ordinary life in a way that is easy to miss if you stare only at the flag, the footprints, and the famous line. People tend to treat Apollo 11 as a grand historical postcard. A rocket goes up, 2 men walk on the moon, the Cold War gets one of its most dramatic scenes, and that is that. It sounds majestic, distant, and slightly museum-like. The truth is much stranger. The moon landing did not stay on the moon. It came home. It changed the machines people used, the images they trusted, the scale on which they imagined politics and science, the kind of future they thought was possible, and even the way they looked back at the Earth itself. The moon landing was not merely a stunt in the sky. It was a shock that worked its way down into ordinary life, like electricity finding every hidden wire in the wall. The amazing part is how many of those wires are still carrying current. Start with the living room, because that is where many ordinary people first felt the event. Roughly 650 million people watched Armstrong's first steps, and in the United States, about 93% of televisions that were on were tuned to the landing. That mattered because Apollo was not merely watched. It was experienced as a shared planetary event. For one night, space stopped being a distant topic for specialists and became something families sat up late to witness together. Grandparents, children, neighbors, bored teenagers, people in apartment blocks and farmhouses all stared at the same grainy image and understood that history was no longer something printed in tomorrow's paper. It could arrive live in your home. That changed ordinary life because it strengthened the sense that modern technology could collapse distance and turn remote events into common experience. The moon landing helped teach the public that global media was not an abstract promise. It was here, humming in the corner of the room. That shift in perception sounds cultural, but it had practical consequences. Once people saw the moon landing live, the public appetite for satellite-based communications and global broadcasting no longer belonged only to engineers and policymen. It became ordinary to expect that the world could be seen together in real time. That expectation would later grow into the habits people now take for granted, from live global news to international sports broadcasts, to the general belief that a major event anywhere ought to be visible everywhere within minutes. Apollo did not create all of that by itself, of course, though it gave those expectations one of their great proving moments. It was a public demonstration that modern communications networks could make the world feel smaller, more immediate, and more synchronized. Ordinary life became more global, partly because the moon landing gave millions of people their first vivid taste of what a shared technological civilization felt like. Once you have watched mankind step onto another world from your couch, your standards for what far away means begin to change. Then there is the quieter and more consequential change: miniaturized electronics. Apollo needed computers that were small, light, and reliable enough to fly. That pressure mattered enormously because the Apollo program became one of the earliest and largest customers for integrated circuits, helping push the chip industry forward at the moment it was still young and expensive. The Apollo guidance computer relied on early silicon chips, and historians of computing note that NASA's procurement made Apollo the largest single consumer of integrated circuits in those early years. In plain English, the moonshot helped create demand for the tiny electronic components that would later make pocket calculators, personal computers, video games, digital watches, and eventually smartphones possible. The moon landing did not invent modern electronics out of thin air. It did something more important. It helped drag them out of the lab and into serious production. Ordinary life changed because the race to the moon accelerated the age of small, cheap, dependable computing. Your phone is not a lunar module, praise God, though some days it does seem to control your mood like mission software with bad intentions. The same goes for software. Apollo's software had to be reliable in a way that ordinary office programs still often fail to be, usually before lunch. Smithsonian's account of Margaret Hamilton's team notes that Apollo's software was built to handle unknown problems and interrupt lower priority tasks to focus on more urgent ones. That mattered during Apollo 11 itself, when the computer alarms did not doom the landing, because the machine was designed to prioritize the essential job. Those may sound like technical details for people who enjoy arguing about code in windowless rooms, yet they helped shape later expectations about what computers could and should do. Apollo pushed forward ideas about real-time computing, fault tolerance, and software discipline that eventually filtered into aviation, industrial systems, and later civilian computing culture. Ordinary life changed because one of the earliest public proofs that software could be trusted with something enormous was Apollo. And once that proof existed, more of life could be handed over to software without everybody breaking into a cold sweat. Some still do, to be fair, and often for good reason. People also remember Apollo through the language of spin-offs, though this subject needs a little cleaning up because space history attracts mythology the way a porch light attracts moths. NASA and Smithsonian both note that many famous NASA inventions are exaggerated or misattributed. Teflon was not invented for Apollo. Tang was not a moon race miracle. The point is not that every object in your kitchen came from the space program. The point is that specific engineering problems from Apollo-era work did produce practical tools that spread outward. Black & Decker's work on lightweight, battery-powered tools for lunar sampling fed later cordless product development, including the famous Dustbuster line. That is a much more believable and more interesting story than the usual fairy tale that the moon landing somehow created every convenience item between the garage and the pantry. Ordinary life changed because Apollo rewarded compact power, portability, and efficiency, and companies learned how to sell those qualities back to people on Earth. The humble cordless tool has more moon dust in its family tree than most people realize. Apollo era needs also reached into health and water. NASA's spin-off records tie silver ionization water purification to Apollo spacecraft and later terrestrial uses in pools, cooling systems, and other water treatment applications. NASA materials also connect digital image processing work developed around space and Earth resources research to medical imaging, including technology that helps support CT scanning. Those are not trivial side notes. They tell you something important about how a huge technical program changes ordinary life. It does not merely create one big success and go home. It creates tools, processes, materials, and problem-solving habits that migrate into medicine, public utilities, manufacturing, and domestic consumer markets. The moon landing mattered because the effort to survive, communicate, navigate, and operate in space forced engineers to solve practical problems under extreme constraints. Then those solutions came back down and found ordinary human uses. A civilization that learns how to keep men alive on the moon usually learns a few useful tricks for hospitals and plumbing along the way. Yet the deepest ordinary change may have been visual and psychological. Before Apollo, Earth was still, for most people, a place experienced from inside. It was the ground beneath your feet, the nation around you, the weather outside your house. Apollo made Earth visible from elsewhere. The Earthrise photograph taken during Apollo 8 became one of the most influential images of the 20th century, and the Smithsonian notes that it helped shift American culture and politics, as well as people's sense of the planet. Later, Apollo imagery, including the blue marble, deepened that effect. Suddenly, Earth looked finite, delicate, singular, and shared. That was not merely pretty, it altered ordinary moral imagination. Environmental concern gained a new iconography. The planet stopped feeling limitless in the old industrial way and started feeling like a whole object, a home suspended in dark space. The moon landing changed ordinary life because it changed the emotional scale on which people pictured the Earth. Once people had seen home from outside, home became easier to think about as something to care for. That change in viewpoint seeped into schools, politics, and popular aspiration. Apollo helped make scientists, engineers, programmers, and test pilots look like cultural protagonists rather than background functionaries. The national epic of the era did not center on a movie star or a robber baron. It centered on men with slide rules, checklists, and enough nerve to ride a controlled explosion toward another world. NASA's own retrospective on Apollo, describes the program as a defining event of the 20th century, and that is not simply because of the spectacle. It is because Apollo told ordinary people that technical mastery could still command the center of public life. Kids grew up wanting to build, calculate, fly, and discover. Schools leaned harder into science. Industry leaned harder into research. Even the disappointments that followed proved the size of the original achievement. People were bitter not because Apollo was small, but because it had taught them to want something much larger from the future than bureaucracy was willing to deliver. Ordinary life changed because the moon landing raised the expected ceiling of human accomplishment. It also changed how ordinary people thought about government, for better and worse. Apollo showed that a state, if sufficiently serious, could coordinate universities, contractors, factories, testing regimes, logistics, and thousands of specialists into one enormous machine pointed at a single task. European Commission research on the Apollo project describes how centralized management, systems engineering, testing, reliability, and operations were woven together to make the program work. Most people never read a page of systems engineering literature, and that is probably for the best if one hopes to remain cheerful, but they lived in the world such thinking helped build. The notion that large technical systems could be managed, measured, and executed at national scale fed later approaches to aerospace, defense, infrastructure, and high-tech industry. The ordinary citizen did not suddenly become an engineer. He did, however, inherit a society with greater faith that complex systems could be organized toward clear ends. That faith has since frayed, which may be why Apollo still glows in memory like a lost virtue. There was also a subtler moral effect. Apollo taught ordinary people that heroism in modern life might wear a headset and a pocket protector instead of a saber. That sounds almost trivial until you remember how much public culture depends on examples. The moon landing made precision admirable. It made competence dramatic. It made discipline beautiful for a moment. People watched not merely a triumph of courage, but a triumph of checklists, simulations, margins, and thousands of acts of quiet excellence. That matters in ordinary life because cultures imitate what they praise. A society that cheers engineers and pilots for achieving something almost absurd may for a time become more hospitable to patience, rigor, and serious work. A society that praises only performers and talkers usually gets more performance and talk. Apollo changed ordinary life partly because it briefly re-ranked honor. It told millions of people that civilization advances when enough competent adults do their jobs with almost unreasonable care. That lesson has aged rather well. And there is one more thing, perhaps the most ordinary and the most profound. The moon landing changed daily life by changing the background story people told themselves about the future. Before Apollo, the future was often spoken of in the thick, heavy language of factories, automobiles, suburbs, and consumer abundance. After Apollo, the future became more technical, more computational, more planetary, more visual, and more ambitious. Even when later decades failed to fulfill the grandest fantasies, ordinary people had seen proof that the future could arrive in a form nobody alive had previously experienced. That psychological shift is difficult to measure and impossible to ignore. It shows up in toys, advertising, architecture, education, science fiction, and the basic expectation that technology ought to keep remaking life. The moon landing did not give every child a jetpack, a moon base, or a silver jumpsuit, which is probably just as well. It gave them something more durable, a widened sense of the possible. So when people ask how the moon landing changed ordinary life, the answer is not simply that it gave us a few gadgets. It changed the way people watched history, the electronics they eventually relied on, the software they trusted, the tools they used, the medical and water systems they benefited from, the way they pictured Earth, the status they gave science and engineering, and the horizon against which they judged the future. Apollo did not stay locked in one heroic week in July 1969. It spilled outward into the living room, the school, the workshop, the hospital, the television schedule, the computer industry, and the human imagination. That is why it still matters. The men went to the moon, the consequences came home, and in their quieter way, they never really left.